virtually all of the Jordan Valley and much of the rest of the West Bank, all of the settlements, all of the illegal settlements. Annexation in the context of international law means seizing land. It means asserting full control over a population of that land by some other force, some outside force, another country, another army. It means, in the Israeli case, providing Israeli citizenship and all of its privileges for all of the settlers. It means officially denying any semblance of voting rights to Palestinians who live in that annexed territory. And because of all that, of course, it violates the first of international laws. It violates the international prohibitions against seizure of territory by force. It violates the International Covenant against the crime of apartheid. It violates a host of the Geneva Conventions. It's a major violation, and it, in fact, challenges what has been the sort of status quo of the Israeli occupation system for decades. So this is a very big deal. Let me start by reading two bits of things that have come in recently. The first is a part of a quite extraordinary statement that was written, drafted by 47 UN special rapporteurs, which is basically all of the rapporteurs who have a very specific mandate, either a geographic area, a mandate for North Korea, there's a mandate for a number of regional areas of crisis, and these are the people who have specific human rights mandate on specific arenas. So the mandate on the international right to food, the right to water, the right to freedom of expression, the right to the defense of human rights defenders, and of course the key advocate here who took the initiative, Michael Lee from Canada, is the special rapporteur on human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. So when all 47 special rapporteurs come together on a statement, it's in UN context a very big deal. Here's part of what they said. The annexation of occupied territory is a serious violation of the Charter of the United Nations and the Geneva Convention. Contrary to the fundamental rule affirmed many times by the UN Security Council and General Assembly that the acquisition of territory by war or force is inadmissible. The international community has prohibited annexation precisely because it incites wars, economic devastation, political instability, systematic human rights abuses, and widespread human suffering. Israel's stated plans for annexation would extend sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty, over most of the Jordan Valley and all of the more than 235 illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. This would amount to approximately 30% of the West Bank. The annexation of this territory was endorsed by the American Peace to Prosperity Plan, released in January 2020. The United Nations has stated on many occasions that the 53-year-old Israeli occupation is the source of profound human rights violations against the Palestinian people. These violations include land confiscation, settler violence, discriminatory planning laws, the confiscation of natural resources, home demolitions, forcible population transfer, excessive use of force and torture, labor exploitation, extensive infringements of privacy rights, restrictions on the media and freedom of expression, the targeting of women activists and journalists, the detention of children, poisoning by exposure to toxic waste, forced evictions and displacement, economic deprivation and extreme poverty, arbitrary detention, lack of freedom of movement, food insecurity, discriminatory law enforcement, and the introduction of a two-tier system of disparate political, legal, social, cultural, and economic rights based on ethnicity and nationality. Palestinian and human rights defenders who peacefully bring public attention to these violations are slandered, criminalized, or labeled as terrorists. Above all, the Israeli occupation has meant the denial of the right of Palestinian self-determination. These human rights violations would only intensify after annexation. What would be left of the West Bank would be a Palestinian Bantustan, islands of disconnected land completely surrounded by Israel and with no territorial connection to the outside world. Israel has recently promised that it will maintain permanent security control between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Thus, the morning after annexation would be the crystallization of an already unjust reality. two peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. This is a vision of 21st century apartheid. Those were the words of the UN Special Rapporteurs, a rather extraordinary indictment, not because it's new, I think, for most people listening tonight, but it's quite new for most UN officials to be stating in such a direct way. The other much shorter quote I wanted to read comes from one Bibi Netanyahu in the Sheldon Adelson run and owned newspaper Israel Hayom. Speaking about annexation, he defined it as the historic opportunity for changing the tide of history, which was pointing one way the whole time. All the diplomatic plans were posed to us in the past, asking us to concede swaths of the land of Israel, return to the 67 borders, and divide Jerusalem to take in Palestinian refugees. This is a reversal. We aren't the ones being forced to make concessions. Rather, the Palestinians are, regardless of negotiations. If they see fit to meet and accept about 10 stringent conditions, including Israeli sovereignty west of the Jordan River, preserving a united Jerusalem, refusing to accept refugees, not uprooting Jewish communities, and Israeli sovereignty in large swaths of Judea and Samaria, the diplomatic process will move ahead. The Palestinians need to acknowledge that we control security in all areas. If they consent to all of this, then we'll have an entity of their own that President Trump defines as a state. There are those who claim, and an American statesman told me, but Bibi, it won't be a state. And I told him, call it what you want. At the heart of the Trump plan are foundations we have only dreamed about. So that's what annexation looks like, right? It's a very big deal. And it's also true that it won't change very much on the ground. Not because it's not a big deal, it is, but because it's already underway. Most of these horrific conditions for Palestinian lives are what Palestinians face on a day-to-day basis for many years now. This isn't something new. The Jordan Valley is already almost entirely out of reach of Palestinians for farming, for living, for anything, because it's been deemed a closed military zone. Settlement expansion has been underway in Israel since 1968, whether under labor governments, Likud governments, combination governments. The lack of rights of an occupied population has been the story of Palestinians since the Nakba of 1948, since the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem of 1967, and it continues today. It is significant that this would mean the transformation of what amounts to de facto annexation into legal or de jure annexation. And everywhere else in the world, other than in the United States and Israel, that's actually a big deal also. And that may mean that it could be the beginning of somewhat of a shift in the international community from condemnation over and over again without any action to perhaps some kind of real action to challenge this legal annexation, maybe even some kind of sanctions against the Israeli arms trade. We should remember that back in 1982 and again in 1983, the General Assembly passed overwhelmingly by huge margins incredibly harsh sanctions against Israel because of its annexation of Jerusalem and its annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights, none of which was ever recognized by the international community. In response, these sanctions were imposed that frankly go way beyond anything any BDS activist ever even imagined. They were very, very harsh sanctions. The relevant parts of them that we might want to think about at some point is only the question of Israel's military arms trade and how that might be changed when de facto segregation, de facto apartheid becomes legal apartheid in the context of the new move towards annexation. Here in the United States, the Trump administration has continued an absolutely extremist version of plans for Israeli-Palestinian relationships. Remember that the negotiations that the Trump administration carried out, led by the Trump son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were based on negotiations between Israel and the United States. Palestinians weren't there. It was between Israel and the United States to figure out how much of the West Bank would be annexed, how many of the settlements would be annexed. That means all of them, as it turns out. All of the illegal settlements would be suddenly deemed to be legal. And this follows, of course, the already extremist moves of the Trump administration of moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the undivided capital only of Israel, recognizing Israeli annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights, cutting off its historic support for UNRWA, the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees, providing military aid at the exact same level as earlier, which amounts to $3.8 billion every year of our tax money that goes directly to the, in goods, goes directly to the Israeli military. And of course, it includes the cuts more broadly to the United Nations. All of this has to do with a kind of extremist foreign policy that we've been seeing from this administration. The annexation doesn't change that, but we have to recognize that the annexation has been enabled by that US foreign policy. That's what changed between US administrations. It's not to say that Barack Obama was a supporter of Palestinian rights as president. He certainly was not. He orchestrated the $38 billion 10-year grant of our tax money to the Israeli military, and that hasn't changed. What has changed has been a willingness to accept and give diplomatic support to the most extreme measures being taken inside Israel. Now, what we're hearing a lot about right now in terms of annexation is that, oh my God, this is terrible because it makes the two-state solution impossible. Well, the two-state solution is impossible, but not because of annexation. The two-state solution was already impossible because Israel had essentially taken all the land that would have made a two-state solution possible back in perhaps 1967. And it's not, there's not going to be negotiations around a two-state solution because it's no longer something that can be negotiated. There is simply no more land. It also, we should recognize, doesn't change too much of the international side. Let me just read you one other bit here. I know I'm reading a bunch from the papers, but I think they are significant, some of these quotes, in terms of who's saying this. This comes from Robert Satloff, who's the executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, one of the leading the leading pro-Israel, uncritical of Israel think tanks here in Washington. And he says, when he's talking about why this isn't really going to change anything, he says, quote, Israel already enjoys complete security control over the West Bank. Its civil law already governs its citizens living there, and it has largely succeeded in normalizing the international community to continued growth in settlement activity. Most relevant actors, the Palestinian Authority, many Arab states, key European capitals, the UN Security Council members, and the United States have reconciled themselves to this reality and do not actively oppose it. So there you have it. Everybody pretty much agrees this isn't going to change anything except make all of these continuing violations somehow legal by the wand waving of Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. So what do we think could happen as a result of all this? This takes place, ironically enough, the conditions on the ground getting worse and worse, the threat of new wars in Gaza, the threat of continued settlement expansion, arrest of children, etc., across the West Bank. All of this happens while the discourse shift in the United States on this question is so profoundly strong in recent years that Israel is now, support for Israel is now becoming a thoroughly partisan issue, which should mean that there's far more room to challenge this notion of uncritical US support as a given. The idea that criticizing Israel is somehow political suicide. It's simply no longer the case. But we have to do a better job than we have of showing that, not just saying it, but showing that to members of Congress, to members of the administration, to the media, to everybody, because people are living in bubbles and don't necessarily even recognize it. The question now of support for Israel is thoroughly a Republican issue. Some of you may be old enough to remember the days when Israel was thoroughly a Democratic issue because it was seen as kind of socialist. It was the kind of Zionism I grew up with, this idea that Israel was this little socialist bastion in the Middle East. And we all supported it as a progressive thing. Republicans wouldn't touch it. The left wing of the Democratic Party was the leading support for Israel. And that's because nobody asked the question of where did that land come from for these little socialist kibbutz movements to be built? Where were the people that were living on that land already supposed to go when Israelis came from Europe in escaping the Holocaust to build this new socialist society? How did that all happen? We didn't ask those questions. But what is true is that it has become a reversal of that partisan reality so that now support for Israel is thoroughly a Republican issue. Let me give you just one example. Back in 2010, now remember, 2010 is the first full year of the second full year of the Obama administration. It's the moment when we're seeing this great tension emerging between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. There's a lot of insults coming from Netanyahu. He's a racist and he's making racist remarks about Obama. There's incredible tension. And the US press is full of articles saying, oh my God, Obama is throwing Israel under the bus. Oh my God, what's happening? We're changing. We're not going to be supporting Israel anymore. The reality was very different. The reality was nobody was being thrown under a bus. There was no bus. And Obama was continuing US military aid and protection, diplomatic protection at the United Nations, the same as every president before him. What was changing a little bit was the discourse. It was a little bit different. But at that moment, what people were hearing was, oh my God, Obama is throwing Israel under the bus. Right at that moment, there's a survey that the Zogby polling outfit does. And one of the questions has to do with Israeli policy in the occupied territories. And the question says, Israelis are building settlements throughout the occupied territories. Which of the following two sentences best describes what you think about it? So sentence number one is, Israelis are building settlements for security reasons and they have the right to build wherever they want. Sentence number two says, Israelis are building settlements on expropriated land and they should all be torn down and the land returned to its original owners. Now, according to international law, that's a pretty accurate statement, but the way it was written was very provocative, deliberately so. Despite the provocation in the language, 63% of Democrats chose door number two. It was stunning. It was one of those moments when it was like, what? Did that just really happen? But it showed us how the discourse was already shifting. In 2016, we saw the debate opening in the Democratic Party in the run-up to the election. In 2018, we saw supporters, direct supporters of Palestinian rights being elected to Congress. And we saw the Bernie Sanders campaign that was emerging at that time beginning to take on recognition of the importance of Palestinian rights. One of the things we're now seeing is this huge divide between some of those members of Congress in the Democratic Party and the Democratic base, who is moving in far greater numbers towards that smaller group of Democratic lawmakers. And instead, we see the Democratic leadership acting as if nothing had ever changed and that support for Israel is a necessary component of being a Democrat or something. It's just not true anymore. And they haven't gotten the memo. So again, what we have to do is figure out ways to show and not just tell how that works. So as this goes forward, one of the things we're seeing is that inside Israel, there's a small, very valiant, but very small and not, unfortunately, very influential grouping of opponents to this move. It's made up of the joint list, the Israeli left, but as we know, the political realities inside Israel have moved dramatically to the right. The Israeli left is a tiny fraction at this point. And the joint list, which is the parties made up primarily of the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinians, has more power now. It's the third largest bloc in the Knesset, but they still are quite isolated and they're not in a position to be able to do anything to stop this move, which is driven very much by Netanyahu's fear of going to prison if he doesn't remain as prime minister. And he will only remain as prime minister if he continues to conciliate his right wing. Because remember, right now in the Israeli cabinet, which has moved so far to the right, that Netanyahu is one of the furthest left in the government by just standing still, because the government is now made up of the right, the far right, the extreme right, and an emerging fascist right. That's the range of opinion. So it's not an optimistic view for something that's going to happen from inside the Israeli scene. So where we are in the United States is one of the key venues where these changes are going to have to be made. And there are opportunities here. And I want to just end with a couple of ideas on that. If we look at the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, one of the things we see is that that movement is stronger than ever, despite all of the efforts by universities under tremendous pressure, by state assemblies, by members of Congress to criminalize BDS, clear First Amendment protected activities, as the Supreme Court has held over and over again. But nonetheless, because BDS is emerging as an increasingly mainstream position, it's being attacked more than ever. We have to, of course, defend particularly the young students who are being attacked so unfairly in these ways. But we also have to recognize that the reason they're being attacked is because this is a nonviolent strategy that is having enormous impact on changing the discourse. The issue of Palestinian rights in this country today is no longer a fringe issue. It's not fringe within the social movements. It's not fringe within the Black liberation movement, within the environmental justice movement, within large parts of the women's movement. It's moving more and more towards the center as a legitimate component of progressive ideas and thinking in this country. So that one of the things that happens is that organizations that are not just part of the left, but that are much more mainstream progressive organizations are at least considering the need to take up some level of defense for Palestinian rights, because they operate much closer to power than some of our solidarity organizations do. So we have these opportunities to shift the discourse even more. The question of annexation puts the question of equality squarely on the agenda. This is no longer a debate about states. Frankly, that was never our call anyway. You know, I'm a Jewish girl from California. Why do I get to say how many states there should be across the world? One state, two state, red state, blue state. This is not our call. The call for us, I believe, should be for our government to support governments around the world, including in Israel, that are based on the rights that we claim to support. We usually don't, but we claim to support in this country and around the world, which comes back to the issue of equality and equal rights. It's going to change the nature of the struggle for Palestinians, I think. But again, that's not up to us to determine. What we have to determine is what policy our government is carrying out. And that means, do we want to accept the idea that we send $3.8 billion of our tax money every year at the height of a moment when there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country, before the 43 million additional people lost their jobs in the last 2 months? Do we want to be spending money on the IDF as a result? You know, that's one side of it. Do we want to be supporting these violations of international law by giving Israel permission to annex territory in complete violation of UN resolutions, the Geneva Convention, etc.? Or do we want to say, no, not one step further? This is where it stops. This is where we build a movement that says this is what apartheid looks like, and we are not prepared to allow our government to pay our tax dollars to support apartheid across the world. So it's not apartheid because it looks like South Africa. Obviously, it looks completely different. It's a very different system. But it's apartheid because it stands in direct violation of the international covenant against the crime of apartheid. So it's our job to change our government. With any luck, we'll have some support from European governments as well as social movements around the world, from some of the African countries, from some of the Arab countries that have been moving closer and closer to Israel in recent years. The making annexation legal may stop all of that, and those will be allies for us. But we have the fundamental job to do, and that is to change our government's position and say no to apartheid, no to annexation, and yes to equality and rights for all.
Thank you, Phyllis. That was really moving. And I think in the Q&A, we may have some more questions about how we can help our government change in a more positive direction. I do just want to tell people that we're not using the chat function. We're using the Q&A function where you can type in your questions and they will be taken up in the question and answer period after we hear from Michel. I also want to tell people that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available through Mass Peace Action on their website after we're done today. So thank you, Phyllis, that was great. Michel, we'd love to hear from you now. This is Michel Moushabeck and our great Interlink publisher and author and hero. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Karen. It was so nice to see you, and thanks to the Middle East Peace and Justice Coalition for inviting me. Great to see you, Phyllis. You know, Phyllis and I have known each other for over 30 years. They call us two peas in a pod. We've worked together on many projects. We've edited several books together. I worked on her very, very first book about the first Intifada back in 1989. So we do think alike in many ways. So I will try not to repeat what Phyllis said today, and I will try and concentrate perhaps on a Palestinian view of what is happening. I would like to start with a disclaimer. I just want to say that I'm not a journalist and I'm not a political analyst. I'm just a book publisher, and 33 years ago I founded Interlink Publishing, and I basically edit books in isolation, whether it's a pandemic or not. So I'm not a scholar either. I am Palestinian, and I do have a few things to say. I often say that if you were to meet me in a pub or in a bar, I know this is impossible now, and if you were to ask me to describe my family's story in one sentence, I would say exile and starting over, exile and starting over, and exile and starting over. I would probably add a clarification that I did not repeat myself 3 times because I had too many beers. For my family's experience of multiple exiles from Katamon to East Jerusalem, to Amman, Jordan, to Beirut, Lebanon, and for me to New York and now in Massachusetts, is not unique. It is but one of the many sad episodes of being Palestinians. But our stories of exile and displacement and injustice will live on. And that's why I do what I do as a publisher. And I tell stories of our beautiful memories of our homeland. During the past couple of weeks, I've been very, very moved by the protests that is going on throughout the US. I have written a lot about racial injustice. I've written about my outrage. I've written about our solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and interlink work on uplifting the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color as part of my publishing program. The importance of this moment in history, a history rooted in systematic racism and violence against Black and indigenous people, cannot be underestimated. The last 2 weeks really have shown us that progress towards justice is possible. We have seen a glimmer of hope. We know that we've seen that there is a reason for hope, that real change might be on the horizon. But this, of course, will largely depend on us. So as we advocate for tearing down the systems of injustice, white supremacy, that ended the lives of so many African Americans, as we fight for building a just society here at home, it's also important for us not to overlook the institutionalized and militarized system of apartheid that exists in the country that our Congress calls our closest friend and the great democracy of Israel. Apartheid is racism. It's racism at its core, and it needs tearing down as well. Every family living under Israeli occupation has a daughter, has a son, has a mother, has a father, has a cousin, or a neighbor called George Floyd. Racism and brutality abroad cannot be separated from racial and social justice at home. How can we end police brutality at home when American law enforcement agencies are sending officers to train in Israel, and they are endorsing Israel's use of brutal force as a model for policing? How can we explain our struggle to end racism here in America when at the same time our government is supporting with our own tax dollars a system of racism and oppression that inflicts suffering on the Palestinians? So now, as Phyllis said, under this cloud of global pandemic, Israel is about to steal another 30% of the West Bank in an historic land grab that furthers Palestinian dispossession. What will this annexation mean? Okay, formalizing what already exists, we know that. Why now? So annexation is really one of the gravest assaults on international law. Israel wants to annex land that does not belong to it. What are the implications? Drastic. What have we learned from Israel's previous annexations of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights? We oppose annexation because we oppose settler colonial ideology. We oppose Zionism as a movement that oppresses the original inhabitants, the Palestinians. Israel has a colonial project. The annexation of a third of the West Bank is simply a continuation of this expansionist plan following the annexation of the Golan Heights, occupied Jerusalem. So annexation, as Phyllis said, is very serious. It's very wrong, and it's a blatant violation of the fundamental principles of international law, including UN Security Council Resolution 242. So call it what you want. Annexation is not a new idea. It has not stopped Israel in the past, and it's not going to stop Israel in the future, because it is part and parcel of the ideology of Zionism and the acquisition of what they call Judea of Samaria. Israel's aim is to acquire all the land with as few Palestinians as possible. That's a given. If the international community puts pressure on Israel, which is probably unlikely, and Israel does not go through this annexation at this time around, then it will try again at a later date. It may be symbolic pressure that will be put on Israel by the European Union, by some of the Arab leaders, just to appease their angry populations. it may delay it because Israel is keen to strengthen its relations, especially with the Gulf states at the moment. The European countries were silent when Trump moved the US embassy to Jerusalem. Therefore, in my view, they were complicit in the violations of Palestinian rights and international law. So were the Arab countries. We have learned recently that Israel has acted, I read it somewhere, aggressively to depopulate critical areas of the West Bank in preparation for annexation. It demolished numerous structures, several hundred, including buildings that were built with international aid. They displaced 300 to 500 people in preparation for the annexation. The important point that we need to keep hammering is that annexation or no annexation, Israel has a long history of land grab and theft since it came into existence. In fact, it is really, in my view, totally ludicrous and very, very naive for anyone to suggest that Israel wants peace. The so-called peace process, the Oslo Accord, were very well crafted to give Israel total control over every aspect of Palestinian life. For decades, the Israelis were masters at using misinformation and media manipulation. They would always claim that, oh, we're always willing to negotiate, but we don't have a negotiating partner. We don't have anybody to negotiate with. They did this for decades, 3 decades, so that they can establish facts on the ground in preparation for this moment. So this immense injustice has brought the Palestinians immense pain. Suffering and suffering and suffering that seem to increase in intensity with every passing day. But why now? Why this moment in history? Why is annexation happening now? When Netanyahu, as Phyllis said, he has pledged to begin the annexation probably within the early July next month. He also said that there will be no freeze on the expansion of illegal settlements. So Netanyahu's pursuit of expansion does 3 things. It's for domestic consumption, there's no doubt about that. Netanyahu is pandering to his base. And he is also, number 2, he's also taking advantage of the fact that Trump still has time before the re-election. He's still president, and he will support the annexation just as he did support the decision to move the US embassy to East Jerusalem. Of course, Netanyahu also wants to distract from his lawsuit, the fraud lawsuit and allegations of corruptions. But to Prime Minister Netanyahu, as Phyllis said, it's an historic opportunity, he called it. He thinks that it would cement his legacy as the longest serving prime minister and as the prime minister who brought Israel the largest territory. And in a way, his stars are really aligned. The US president who thinks he's God and he's on a messianic mission, a global threat of a pandemic, fears of an economic meltdown, an ineffective and corrupt Palestinian Authority, rampant factionalism between the PA, Fatah, and Hamas, authoritarian Arab leaders focused on destroying Iran and aligning their political interests with Israel and the United States. And of course, as Phyllis said, the Israeli left and even the Israeli center is non-existent. So this is the climate that now shapes Israel's identity. The only meaningful opposition that we hear about is coming from the far right, the extreme right. The settlers and the far right consider this is very moderate. It's not enough. The proposed partial annexation does not satisfy them on religious or on militaristic grounds, because they believe they are entitled to the whole of historic Palestine. I'm going to take a few moments and say a few words about how the Palestinians view this annexation. Palestinians, of course, unanimously reject the annexation and the so-called Trump's deal of the century, which requires that really Palestinians give up everything, recognize Israel as a Jewish state with all of Jerusalem as its capital, give up the right of return, accept the annexation of the Jordan Valley and the illegal settlements, and agree to live in Bantustans. In return, they'll be given $50 billion over 5 years. That's the deal of the century. The deal really does not change the conditions on the ground for Palestinians. It only helps legitimize Israeli colonial project and emboldens Israel to pursue at an ever accelerating rate the seizure of more Palestinian land and the displacement of more Palestinian people. This means that Palestinians will have no legal rights to demand equality or representation. This also means that Jewish citizens will continue to be the majority population after the project of annexation has been completed. The PA, in a gesture, has withdrawn from the Oslo Agreement and has suspended security cooperation for the time being with Israel. How true is this suspension of security cooperation? We don't know. How long will it last? We don't know. But I suspect that it's only a partial and symbolic suspension that it will be taking place. From Israel's point of view, it would prefer to continue to allow the PA to exist as long as the PA does its bidding and continues to provide security for Israel. Without the PA, Israel would not have been able to sustain the occupation and expand settlements all those years. Of course, the annexation adds the fears to the fears of the Palestinians going forward. It will increase Palestinian mistrust in the United States, in the European nations, and the Arab nations. Israel, next the west and east of Jerusalem and a number of other surrounding neighborhoods in 1948 and 1967. This time around, with Trump's help, Israel can argue that the annexation of the West Bank was legitimate. Why? Because it is now recognized by the world's largest superpower. That's the line Netanyahu is going to be taking. This provides Israel with further cover to seize Palestinian land and dispossess Palestinians by by the Trump administration giving them the green light of this de facto annexation that has already taken place. Most people's lives are dictated by the hardship of the occupation, which has already transformed communities into fragmented little Bantustans. The roadblocks, the checkpoints, the lack of water, the separation wall, the restriction of movement, the constant surveillance, and on and on and on. The annexation is going to more severely curtail the movement of the Palestinians. It has the intentional effect to further restrict Palestinians' natural growth. Everyone agrees that Palestinians have a leadership crisis, which has allowed Israel to keep creating facts on the ground. It's time that we as Palestinians and our supporters call for a renewed and reinvigorated Palestinian leadership to take on current challenges in this crucial time. Both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas—
Michel,
Yep.
Michel, we lost you. Michel, we lost your sound. Michel, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear him.
You can hear him, okay. I guess it's just me.
So I was talking about Palestinian leadership crisis. Can you hear me, Phyllis?
Yes.
Okay. So both the Palestinian Authority, Fatah and Hamas are at fault.
Lost my.
They have squandered the moment. They have messed up royally. They failed to bring about a unified Palestinian front. The Palestinian leadership and Palestinian civil society must rethink their whole strategy and what liberation means. Israel has always used the classic colonial tactic of proposing agreements after agreements with the Palestinians in order to buy more time to steal more land. I've made this point before, creating facts on the ground, drawing new boundaries.
I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea.
Can you mute yourself while you figure that out for Michelle?
You want to just use my computer? I don't know why your sound has stopped working.
Michelle can.
Karen, you want to just use my computer? I'm in my study.
Well, Marion says I should mute myself. I'm sorry,
Okay, we can hear you now.
guys.
So for Palestinians, let's talk about
Can you hear me now?
in the diaspora.
No.
Palestinian Americans and their supporters really need to rise up and capitalize on the moment, on their strength to revitalize the demand.
I have a solution. You come to my study, you work through my computer.
The right of
Is it up?
return.
Can you get to me? Am
Yeah.
I showing?
Yeah, you're showing your sound is just out for unknown reasons. So just, I'll read the question.
In short, the annexation plan brings an end to the so-called two-state solution. It's a hollow mantra that the US and Israel never fully pursued. As Phyllis said, Palestinians want freedom, they want equality, they want justice, they want dignity. Palestinian identity and the right of self-determination cannot be detached from Palestinians' attachment to the
We have about, I had to go to my husband's computer to get my sound back. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, and I
Okay.
can hear you now. We
Okay.
have about half an hour left for question and answer. So I would like to
Okay.
move to that. I'm very
All right.
sorry for losing my.
No, not at all. I will stop here, but I hope we can, at least Phyllis and I can get the opportunity towards the end to say what Palestinians and supporters can do to help in this particular moment.
Okay, good, good. So the,
So here's the questions.
okay. So the first
You
question,
can start with this one.
Okay.
Okay.
yes, first question that came in is, are there any, this is about US politics and what we can do. Are there any recent polls showing Democratic voters oppose annexation and even more importantly, want to see sanctions if Israel goes ahead and annex? That same person has another question related, but let's start with that one. Is there any evidence, polling evidence, that Democratic voters are opposed to annexation and doing something about it?
I don't know about, there is one poll that I heard about. I'm not familiar with it, so I can't speak to it, but there was also some indications of openness to pressure on Israel of undefined nature about what the response should be. That people are not quite as passive about this one as they have been about issues in the past. Yeah, so I think that all the polls have been indicating right now there is a plurality of support among Democrats, among young people, among people of color, and a couple of other categories that support, depending on how the question is worded, support Palestinian rights more than they support Israel, which is a real shift. It's a very significant shift.
Mm-hmm. The follow-up question is, do you think that the letter that is being circulated by Democrats in the House criticizing annexation will have any effect, and what can we do to encourage them to make it have an effect?
There's several letters circulating. I'm not sure which one they're talking about. There's one that's sort of a mainstream Democratic Party one, which is probably getting the most attention. And it doesn't call for any consequences. It just criticizes and says it's a bad idea. But does not call for conditioning military aid. That, for the first time, is now a real possibility. Bernie Sanders has raised it. A number of other members of Congress have raised it. And I think that in the context of Betty McCollum's bill that prohibits any US support going to the Israeli system of military detention for Palestinian children, that was there is a new mood in Congress that certain things can be discussed. I don't think we can look to seeing a successful campaign yet, but I think that there have been very important campaigns that are already underway. Jewish Voice for Peace is engaged in that. Some of the broader peace groups are taking it up. There's a letter that's recently, just a couple of days ago, or actually yesterday, was sent to the two candidates, to Biden and to Trump, calling for a more progressive policy specifically on Israel-Palestine that speaks to the issue of annexation and does speak about the need to cut military aid, condition military aid. So I think these things are being discussed in a whole new way. I don't think any of them right now are on the agenda in Congress. The fact that they're on the agenda in op-eds, in mainstream political discourse is a huge step forward.
Congress traditionally has always rewarded Israel for its crime by sending it more military aid. We don't see any difference now. The failure of Congress to hold Israel accountable is really overwhelming. Nevertheless, I think what Phyllis said is really very, very important for us. I've heard of a campaign that is being talked about by the folks at Jewish Voice for Peace that is going to demand that Congress stop all military aid to Israel if Israel annexes 1 acre of the West Bank or a single West Bank settlement. I think this is a very important campaign to support. At least even if we fail, it will show the hypocrisy of members of Congress in this endeavor.
There's a question, actually two questions related to each other about Palestinian politics. Michel, do you have any idea of what next steps Palestinians can take, what their leaders can take? And the related question is, do you, who are the regional allies of the Palestinian people? Are there governments or movements or NGOs that might have some influence in the region? You both laugh, okay.
Well, I can start by telling you that today the level of Palestinian despair is at an all-time high. Palestinians continue to be colonized, Palestinian lands continue to be confiscated for illegal settlements, house demolitions and burning of olive groves. Palestinian refugees continue to be exiled, and Palestinians living inside Israel continue to be discriminated against. And all this is being done under the watchful eye of Israel's greatest ally, the United States. Israel has not only recently continued to do that, but it has really intensified its inhumane policies and violations. For us, as Palestinians, now the first thing we should do is really, we must acknowledge the mistakes of the past and say, and admit that we have not been able to liberate even an inch of Palestine and bring justice to the Palestinian people. The annexation proves that the two-state solution, which, by the way, Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmad and just around after the Oslo Accords had said it, they said it's a total failure, you know.
Yeah.
So going forward, Palestinians and their supporters should not make any compromises as far as their human rights are concerned.
I would just add to that, number one, the question of where Palestinian public opinion is. There's a big change underway inside the Palestinian territories, which of course is not the majority of Palestinians, but it is an important constituent. And there is a new organization called One Democratic State that has emerged among some leading Palestinians that are taking a very different position than the PA and the traditional Palestinian diplomatic position. Again, that's not our call here in the US, but I think that what the move towards annexation has done, I mentioned this earlier and Michel did as well, is put on the agenda the priority of focusing on rights rather than states. So that becomes the way that we talk about what needs to change. We need equal rights for everybody who lives in that area, whether it's in one state or two states or three states. Within every state and between every state, there must be equality, there must be equal rights. One of the particular campaigns that Michel mentioned as well, the Deadly Exchange campaign that was initiated by Jewish Voice for Peace and has been part of big coalitions in a number of cities that focuses on these campaigns that are often led by the Anti-Defamation League. They run a bunch of them, they fund them, they organize them, and send US police to Israel to train together. I think we have to be very careful not to imply that somehow it takes Israel to turn US police into racist killers. That is very much an indigenous reality of the United States from long before Israel ever existed. But it's a question of exchanging deadly practices on both sides, making both sides worse, and challenging that. It's something that Northampton has played a leading role in. There was a big campaign 2 years ago to stop the trip. Skip the trip was the call, I think, to prevent Northampton police from going off on one of these trips on a junket to train with Israel.
Yes, a group of us met with the mayor and the police chief and dissuaded them from sending the chief to Israel. Yeah,
exactly. And those kinds of campaigns are now going on in a number of places around the country. And in the light of the current uprising against police brutality against African Americans, and particularly, of course, around the killing of the whole set of recent victims, that campaign is kicking off again. So I think it is an important thing, and we all point to Northampton as one of the examples of how that can work with persuasion, even without a legal challenge.
But getting back to the caller who asked about what Palestinians can do.
Yes.
You know, Palestinians, there are 13 million of us, you know, and we are a fragmented nations. We are all over the place. So it's really important for us to be speaking in one voice. And that is very, very important for people in the international community to hear that Palestinians are speaking in one voice. So it is time for the old Palestinian Liberation Organization, in my view, to be resurrected, because it's a body that is more representative of Palestinians all over the world, both living under occupation and those living in the diaspora. That's, I think, important thing that Palestinians can do.
One of our questioners asks, what will it take for Palestinian leadership to come together and truly accomplish that?
Shall I raise my hands?
Oh, it's a struggle.
Can I say something about that? I mean, it's funny on one level, but I think that's really the wrong question. I know we're always supposed to say there are no wrong questions, but it's not up to us to determine how a people living under military occupation, in exile, in refugee camps. Yeah, you and I can have whatever criticisms we want about the leadership, but it's not up to us. Our job, and we haven't done it very well. We shouldn't be. Our leadership is not anything to brag about either. So I think we have to concentrate on what happens here. How do we work to change U.S. policy that right now serves as the main financier, enabler, and military protector and diplomatic defender of all of the Israeli violations? That's our job. It's not our job to worry about what's it going to take to get the Palestinian leadership back to be accountable to its own population. Palestinians have to do that.
And some people are also calling for Palestinians in the diaspora to really to organize under a progressive agendas, different from the agenda of the past. You know, that Palestinians really in the diaspora cannot see dispossession in Palestine as separate from oppression of Black and indigenous people, queer people, and undocumented communities in the United States. As taxpayers and as members of communities in the US, Palestinian Americans can actually affect change. And they cannot really isolate themselves from their daily lived experiences and must work against violence perpetrated by white supremacy here at home and as well as abroad. So it is, yet fighting for a progressive agenda in the United States does not mean giving up Palestinian identity.
We have a couple of related questions about what we in the US are doing. So I think it's a good place to put those in. One person, Sarah, asks, what is your opinion of the strategic impact of organizations like J Street to advance the cause of equality and mobilize opposition to current Israeli government policies? And then the second related question, so that one maybe we'll go to Michel, and then perhaps Phyllis could answer this one from Jim. Phyllis's description of how Israeli policy, I guess, has become a Republican and partisan issue ought to be frightening to every Israeli, given that the Republican base is largely either Christian fundamentalist or white supremacist, in other words, anti-Semitic. Do you think that ending up with a base of supporters that love Israel and hate Jews will have long-term consequences for Israel? Does this development leave an opening for progressives whose policies actually would help support a viable, durable, and democratic state? So, Michel, can you take the first one? What do you think about the impact of organizations like J Street? Have they made a difference?
I think they are making a difference that is allowing us to be able to reach out to people who are listening to J Street and change their minds even further. I don't think J Street as an organization in and of itself is really fighting for Palestinian rights at the moment. So I think there is a conversation to be going between Palestinians in the diaspora and J Street. I don't know how Phyllis feels about that.
I would just say quickly that I think J Street plays a very important role in providing protection for some members of Congress who want to do something closer to the right thing. I agree they don't even claim to support Palestinian rights. They define themselves as pro-Israeli and pro-peace, not pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. It's pro-Israeli and pro-peace. They stand against the occupation. They have been moved to the left largely by their own younger leadership. But I think they play a role in Washington that's useful and should not be confused with grassroots mobilization that's really focused around Palestinian rights, as Michel said.
And with regard to the Israeli policy having become a Republican and partisan issue, and what that means for the long-term outcome for Jews,
is a very important and potentially quite long-term shift. I think the description is quite accurate, that there's a whole cadre of people, many of whom support the president, not all, I suppose, but many, who are very protective of Israel, defensive of Israel, come out of some version of Christian Zionism, but have little interest in protecting Jews in the US who may actually face the real anti-Semitism of white supremacy. So it's a very, it's going to be a mixed bag for Israel. This isn't new for Israel. Israel has for years gotten major support in the United States from Christian Zionists, and when asked, why would you, as a so-called Jewish state, why would you accept support from these people whose theological basis for supporting Israel is thoroughly anti-Semitic? For those who aren't familiar with it, the short version of the theological basis for Christian Zionism is essentially that it's support for the ingathering of Jews in Israel, in ancient Palestine, in today's Israel, because that's the prerequisite before the second coming of Christ. And when the second coming happens, all those Jews that have been gathered in one place will have the choice to either convert or die, which I got to say, as a Jew, is not exactly my favorite choice. But it is quite a dangerous thing. And Israeli officials asked about it in the past have said various versions of, oh, we don't take that seriously. We don't believe any of that. We will take support from wherever we get it. It's a very transactional approach, and it will have long-term impact, I think, on how Israel is viewed in the United States and how supporters of Israel are viewed in the United States.
Wait, we have a question. I think this could start with Michel on this one from Tom Suarez. In regard to annexation's silver lining, in quotes, that is, you can use it to expose the apartheid of Israeli policy to the general Western public. Do you have any thoughts as to why this did not happen with the annexation of East Jerusalem and parts of Abu Dis and Bethlehem? Why it had the same opportunity? Why didn't it happen then? Why is it happening now?
I think the U.S. had an important role to play in of course, the annexation of the Golan Heights, the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and Trump in the last 3.5 years really changed U.S. foreign policy with regard to Jerusalem, Golan Heights, the settlements, UN aid to Palestinian refugees, and so on and so forth. And I should say that all this was done at the advice, or I should say insistence, of his biggest donor, the casino magnate Sheldon Adelson and of course, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who were both openly Zionists and funders of Israeli settlements. So Trump moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, which is a violation of the UN resolution. He endorsed Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, recognizing Israeli ownership. What makes this different today than under past administration is that there is no accountability for Netanyahu's actions. Under previous administrations, under George Bush Sr. and even George Bush Jr., and throughout US history, you know, Israeli settlements have always been considered illegal. And Trump changed all that, and we're not going back. He's already caused enormous harm to Palestinians. And now he is giving his friend Bibi Netanyahu the green light to annex the West Bank and steal more Palestinian lands. Now, we don't know exactly what this is going to happen and whether it's going to be different, but annexation of any part of the West Bank would most likely trigger intense pressure in the West, you know, maybe to impose some sanctions. If the West does not impose any sanctions, it really is destroying whatever credibility it has left in their system of international law. Some critics are really downplaying what's the annexation, the odds of a resurgence of violence on the West Bank. They point to the non-existence of this violence after Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of, as Israel's capital, and his decision to move the US embassy. But I think annexation this time around is going to be different. The upcoming annexation plan could have a George Floyd moment. It could really lead to mass protests that would push the Palestine-Israel issue back to center stage and give it some media attention, especially if it spreads to other parts of the Arab world and fuels widespread uprisings. So whether this will lead to another so-called American intifada of the last couple of weeks is yet to be seen. Did I answer your question, Tom?
If I could just add one other thing to that, I think I agree with all that you said, Michel. I would just add the point that this being potentially a George Floyd moment, the same question emerges. So many African Americans have been killed at the hands of police. Why is it that the killing of George Floyd sparked this uprising across the country? Why was it different? People have been asking that question, and some of it has to do with it was seen, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds were seen by so many people. The agony was seen by so many, and that's certainly part of it. But I don't think that's all of it. It's also moments of history come. If we all think back to the first intifada in Palestine, that was sparked when 4 Palestinians were killed when they were run over by an Israeli military truck. It wasn't the first time that it happened. It had happened numerous times before. Why did that one have the impact that it did? It's one of those moments in history that, for that moment, those people that heard about it first had enough, and they started it. And the same thing happened here with the killing of George Floyd. I don't know if this will be that. The one thing that's different is that we will be hearing, what does annexation mean? It means taking this land, that the people who live on this land will not have the right to vote. There will be 2 systems. That's not different. That's exactly what we've had both inside Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza, where there's 3 different legal systems. But most people in this country don't know that. If this provides the moment when people learn that, that's what could see a real international response that would be very different than what we've seen in the past.
But it's also, you know, as it is our responsibility as white people to end racism and fix the structural racism and white supremacy in this country at every level in our society. By the same token, it's really up to Jews also to confront and end the system of apartheid that we are witnessing. So it is really a double confrontation, I should say.
So we have two questions about strategy for us in the US. One is, what about BDS? Is this something that could become a more powerful tool to undo the troubles that have been created by the Trump administration, Kushner in particular, as mentioned here? And then, is it possible to stop funding the US military, to stop US funding for the Israeli military completely? Is that something that we could do and should do?
I mean, the short answer is that BDS is already a very powerful tool. BDS is a nonviolent movement, and it has been spreading very, very widely on the international arena. And so I see it going from strength to strength.
That's absolutely right. On the question of military aid, which I think is a critical feature of our movement and has been for 25 years or more, there is a new potential for it. The language that's being used in Congress is conditionality. I don't think anybody's talking about cutting military aid to nothing at this point. Of course it should be, but that's, you know, that's our demand as a movement. What's possible, I think, is some kind of congressional support for conditioning aid on the on the US human rights laws that already exist, that Israel has largely been disconnected from. It's been largely protected and hasn't been held accountable. Things like the Arms Export Control Act that prohibits sending arms to the militaries of countries with a pattern and practice of human rights violations. The Leahy Law that prohibits sending arms to any section of a military force in any country that can be proven to have been engaged in human rights violations. Israel has always been excluded from consideration under those laws. Bringing Israel under those umbrellas, as weak as they are, is a very important first step. And I think places like Massachusetts, where there's a strong progressive congressional grouping with Jim McGovern and Ayanna Pressley and others, that might be a very important place to ally them with some of the people in Congress who are already raising the question of conditionality on human rights grounds.
Yes, we have met with Jim McGovern, and so has JVP. So we are close to the end of our time here, and I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to say one last thing to our audience, to our attendees. What would you like to leave us with? Phyllis, will you go first?
Sure. We're at an extraordinary moment of history. We're at a moment when the focus on how fundamental racism is to the history of this country, the recognition that this country was founded on the intersection of genocide and slavery, also, as Howard Zinn always taught us, was also based on the movements against genocide and slavery. I think those two realities, when they come together, are more crucial now than ever. The question of Palestinian rights is not separate. Part of the work we need to do to change what happens in this country and what we make possible in Palestine and Israel.
Thank you. Michel.
Well, despite all the depressing news in the last hour or so, I do have two things to say that give me hope. One is that the fact that the memory of the Nakba today is stronger than ever before. I am more active politically than my parents. My children are more active politically than I am. And I see young Palestinians really keeping the memory of al-Nakba alive, and they are making us proud. They will never give up the fight, and until Palestinians get freedom and equality and dignity and human rights, I think they will continue the struggle. The other point that I see is that I'm really encouraged by the younger generation of Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora in the United States, who are joining the call for Palestinian rights and creating the kind of activism in Israel and abroad that we have not seen before. But I will leave you with one final thought. As Phyllis said, as the protesters are demanding that we tear down, for example, the statutes of Confederate generals, and as they are now joined by protesters in the UK and France and Australia and elsewhere who are tearing down statutes of racist colonial figures, I think it is time that we tear up the 1917 Balfour Declaration and add the name of Arthur Balfour to the list. He is the British Prime Minister, by the way, who was the architect of this criminal declaration. If we should add his name to the list of colonial racists. The Balfour Declaration is the reason why in 1948, my family was terrorized. They were displaced from their home in West Jerusalem. They became refugees in countries that didn't want them. So I carry their pain with me to this day. And as I speak up against anti-Black racism in America, I will always raise my voice in support of Palestinian rights. And my staff, my young staff, will never forgive me if I didn't tell you guys to please follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and check out, visit our website. We have a number of great new books on Israel, Palestine, including Phyllis's updated edition of the primer. So please go there, support us. It is the only way that will keep us alive, that will keep us fighting and growing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Phyllis and Michel. This has been really an eye-opening experience for me in many ways, being a webinar host for the first time. But I would like to say that we at Middle East Peace and Justice Coalition will be sending out an email to all our attendees, just a follow-up email. And we'd like to hear from you if you choose to share your thoughts with us. Thank you to the attendees, the registrants, and thank you to our panelists. Good night.
Good night. Thank you all.
Thank you.